The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Steven Schroefs. Welcome to this Fleet Europe webinar on alternative powertrains in association with GE Capital. The information shared with you today is subject to disclaimers which can be viewed in detail via the recording of this session, which will be shared on fleeteurope.com. The theme of today's webinar is Alternative Powertrains, how to make hybrids fit your fleet. In 2014, the share of alternative powertrains in Europe grew, but only slightly compared to the year before. According to figures from data specialist Dataforce, it still remains on very low levels, with only 3.3% of alternative powertrains in true fleets. And although corporate fleets show big interest in new powertrain cars, different elements are impacting the possible success of alternative powertrains. For sure, there is the cost of technology and the cost of use, combined with taxation schemes and incentives. The available fuel and recharging infrastructure also plays a role. And let's not forget driver behavior. It is clear that hybrids, full electric or hydrogen vehicles are less applicable for every business driver in your company. So the exercise to decide on what powertrain fits what driver is much more complex than with traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. But as said, interest is out there, and the category of vehicles expected to become a real force to be reckoned with in 2015 will be hybrid vehicles. If this is indeed the case, this will become clear during this webinar. We of course ask that when you deal with alternative powertrains that you keep your eyes on the big picture, and that big picture will become clear during the 45 minutes of this webinar. So, we have today two expert speakers among us. After my introduction, we will have an insight from Florian Waldegger of GE Capital International, and afterwards there will be a case study presentation of Gregory Beck of Johnson & Johnson. First, Florian Waldegger, Director Global Fleet Consulting of GE Capital International, will give insight in several key trends about alternative powertrain vehicles with a focus on hybrids based on a unique international survey GE's Consultancy division Key Solution conducted this year. Afterwards, Mr. Beck, EMEA Category Manager Fleet at Johnson & Johnson, will explain how he and his company have addressed the alternative powertrain question with a case study on hybrids in the J&J fleet. We will end the webinar with a short Q&A session. As a participant, you are free to send your questions for the expert speakers by using the chat function of this webinar tool. So please indicate also to which expert speaker your questions are addressed. So let's go with the first expert presentation. We have among us Florian Waldegger of GE Capital. And Florian, he will give us more insight in the interesting survey that they did, and you will have the opportunity to hear about the first results of that survey. So let me hand over the microphone to you, Florian.
Steven, thank you very much, and thank you to all attendees giving us the opportunity to talk about during today's topic. Sorry. Isn't it difficult these days to take decisions, especially in the fleet segment? So many new technologies are coming up, but which ones are the best for you and your company? Today, during the session, I would like to answer a few strategically important points. So, Steven, can I kindly ask you to introduce the next page? As of the binding target by the European Commission, everyone has to take care of its package and to develop environmentally friendly solutions. And personally, I do believe we all have to do something about improving our behavior. Therefore, not only taxation change is forcing us to select greener vehicles, also OEMs, or called car manufacturers, improving their product portfolio and had to commit themselves achieving an overall average of 95 grams by the end of 2020. Of course, and not unexpected, still 32% of the research and development budget is invested to invent new downsized and more efficient internal combustion engine. But also equally 15% is invested into plug-in hybrids, as well 15% into hybrid electric vehicles. This will help every OEM to achieve its upcoming targets, and most probably ourselves to emit less emissions while driving a car. Furthermore, we see first shifts in the mindset of people more towards smaller cars or also smaller engines. This is the case if you talk to people who have to buy the car personally. But also all dedicated company car drivers should change their mind, and this is happening because of companies focusing more and more their car policies not only on costs but also on environmental strategic guidelines such as CO2 caps. And as many companies already doing this and are glad to look into the future preparing themselves, it will be crucial to understand when the correct moment will be to introduce also the latest technology into their car policy. Before going into the results of our research, please let me explain you on the next page what we have considered in how we were conducting the results of our benchmark. Together with my team, we have selected a wide range of available products coming from several manufacturers, from typical German brands up to the Swedish and Japanese ones. All of them are included in our review. Giving you a clear picture of the true costs, we have considered all angles such as the initial investment, which is not only the purchase price, also tax incentives or other components. For plug-in hybrids, you will need also a charging station. We assumed a rather small amount with only 2,160 euros. And before taking any decision, you should not forget that a driver will need the possibility to recharge its car at home as well as at the office. So most probably you will need even a second charging station. Of course, residual values is a key component of the monthly lease rate, which also includes costs like maintenance, repair, tires, and even more. Lastly, the most important component will be the fuel part. This is based on the manufacturer average fuel consumption and the local fuel prices. As everyone has its own special deals with electricity supplies, we have not taken into account any electricity costs at this stage. Meaning, if you consider the usage of a plug-in hybrid in your fleet, do not forget to have in mind further energy supply negotiations, the charging station infrastructure at the office, as well the recharging cost itself. To simplify the results overview, we have compared the cars segment by segment using the most equivalent traditional internal combustion engine version, as well the most fleet relevant ICE version. This allowed us to review 56 different combinations, which in 95% the hybrid is more expensive by between 10 and up to close to 16% on average. Let's dig deeper into the results. Stephen, may I ask you to flip to the next page, please? Why is it that plug-in hybrids and hybrids are more expensive? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Nowadays, still the investment is between 17 and 40% higher versus the traditional technology. Furthermore, the residual values are still very conservative, as no one does really know how the second-hand car market does perceive these cars. I will talk later a bit more about the reasons therefore. The fuel spend itself. Surely the average fuel consumption claimed by manufacturers based on a harmonized test approach does look great, but what happens in reality? Do the drivers always recharge the batteries when needed and the possibility is given? Or does the plug fit? Do the drivers use the additional electric engine in the right manner, or do they play Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso when the lights switching from red to green? Reviewing very detailed our customers' portfolio and working together with early adopters, were identified differences between at least 25 up to 400% higher fuel consumption as claimed by the OEMs. This is purely related to the misbehavior of the drivers. If you would like to integrate latest technologies into your fleet, you will need to invest also time and money to change the behavior of the company car drivers. Of course, we have identified cases where it makes sense to consider it as an alternative, which is obviously led by tax incentives. Will the business case still be beneficial if governments deciding not to support at the same level? Overall, plug-in hybrids and hybrids can be between 1 and 45% more expensive. I would like to explain more in detail how we came to this conclusion. Let's speak first on the next page about the fuel component. As explained before, the deviation between the theoretical fuel consumption and the realistically one is led by the behavior of the driver. I would like to show you the impact on the TCO. The first scenario shown in the fuel pump is of course based on the TCO by using manufacturer terms. Already in this case, traditional technology is 10% less expensive. But as we all do know, also with a diesel or petrol car, usually drivers never achieve the theoretical average. Therefore, in the second scenario, we have added 10% fuel spend for both sides of the comparison. If we uplift the fuel spend, we can see a slightly beneficial move. Now the traditional engine will be only 9.3% less expensive. But having said, our research identified much higher fuel consumptions. Therefore, we have worked out a third scenario. Adding 10% to the traditional version of the car and adding 25% on top to the plug-in hybrid or hybrid version. Now the diesel car is on average across Europe 14.6% less expensive. And this result is without considering any additional electricity costs. Surely we can see also differences between the vehicle segments. This is what I would like to show you on the next page. Stephen, if you can introduce the next page, please. Thank you. I'm getting you would assume the bigger the car is, the bigger the difference will be. This is not the case. While in the mini city car segment, the plug-in is 21% more expensive, in D segment, the diesel engine is between 8 and 10% less expensive as well in the SUV segment. We will face a 10% higher cost on the plug-in hybrid and hybrid side. All the results might sound very negative, but I already mentioned it before. Of course, we identified also possibilities. Latest technologies will make sense. And these will be introduced from me now on the following page. In the Netherlands, one of the most mature markets in regards to supporting environmental friendly cars, the Volkswagen Golf GTE will be cheaper compared to a 2 liters diesel with equivalent horsepower. While the purchase price is still 37% higher compared to the diesel one, the lower BPM has that positive effect that the overall TCO on the diesel car is 8% above the GTE. Also in the UK, the Golf GTE is the more beneficial car. The fact that this diesel equivalent is 4% more expensive on a TCO basis might be obsolete as soon as we would consider electricity costs on top. And by the way, the 4% are representing only 18 British pounds per month. Last but not least, the Ford Mondeo will be a possibility for the Swedish market as for now. Only 2% higher list price to support the business case. Again, the result does not include any charging costs. On my last page, finally, I would like to speak about buyers' considerations. Of course, we can see pros and cons. As pros can be seen, the grants and subsidies from the governments in certain markets. Of course, no range anxiety versus a pure electric vehicle. The fuel efficiency and the low emissions. Very important, the low benefit in kind. As an example, in the Netherlands, the impact can be up to 450 euros per month net. Parking benefits. And last but not least, the exempt of congestion charges like in London or the LEZ charges. But talking about also the cons, we have to consider high investment from up to 40%. Still, the lack of recharging infrastructure on the road, as well at home and at the offices, and also the different plug system existing. The battery and warranty risk all of us are facing, as well the improving efficiency of internal combustion engines. Summarise said, we as the key solutions team identified business cases where it can make sense, but clearly most important, firstly, will be the change of the driver behavior and how to use the supporting electric power. And if you as a company would like to introduce this new technology, you will have to consider several crucial points in your strategy, which will impact also the car policy. Thank you for your time, and don't hesitate to ask any questions by the end of the session. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Florian, for your presentation. As indicated already by Florian, at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session with our experts. So if you have a question for Florian and later on for Greg, please use the chat function to send your question and also mention to who your question is addressed to, so that I as a moderator can ask the relevant question to the relevant person. Thank you very much. So I think that it's great that after having had a bigger picture, let's say, of alternative powertrains and more specifically hybrid vehicles, we can now come to a best practice. And Johnson & Johnson, as you know, healthcare company, is at the forefront of many developments, and innovation is part of their DNA. Also in fleet management, this is the case, and so we are really happy that Gregory Beck, EMEA Category Manager Fleet, has found the time for us to explain a little bit more about how his team and his company looks at alternative powertrains, and more specifically at the introduction of hybrids in the vehicle fleet. So Greg, the webinar floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for everyone for who's spent the time to dial in and listen to us. Hybrid vehicles and alternative powertrains is a very interesting topic for me, so I'm very happy to be able to present what we've done at Johnson & Johnson so far. If we can move on to the next slide, Stephen. What I do want to start with is a document that some of you may be aware of, some of you may not be aware of. The importance is that the Credo document that Johnson & Johnson has is a document that many decisions in the business have been made based on for many years, and it's something that our fleet team works very closely with when we develop our policies. So diving into a bit more detail specific to this particular topic, Stephen, if you click the next slide, there is specific mention to the environment. Now, this document was written in 1947, so it's quite forward-thinking. The environment was already in there. And here you can see we have it in our DNA, and we have it in our way of thinking and our mindset that we must look after our environment and the natural resources. So alternative powertrains, hybrid vehicles very much tie into that part of our Credo document. So what was important to us, we have some experiences. So Johnson & Johnson actually owns over 3,000 vehicles, hybrid vehicles and electrics globally. So we had a lot of experience we could pull on when we started looking into this and developing policies around this. We were able to reach out to our colleagues, both within the EMEA region but also around the globe, into other regions as well, and get a lot of their advice and experience and expertise. And as we became more aware of what we wanted to do, this became very critical for our decision-making process, having that experience and expertise, which is why I'm very happy to share some of our findings with the people on the call today. And lastly, the current hybrids and electric vehicles that we did have within the fleet, some of them were purchased within regional strategy and some of them were not, because hybrids were such a unique vehicle. You know, in the last 5-10 years ago, there was no real strategy around it, and one of my tasks was developing a strategy, and this is why we started this whole process. So we did work together with Florian and his team. So I just want to give you a review of what we went through with them. So firstly, they were able to provide us obviously with wider market information specific to our case. As Stephen mentioned, we're a healthcare company and we're not a bank. We're not a fleet management company and we're not many other things, but we are a healthcare company, and that's our main focus. In the second part here, that information was used to build a case study or a business case for the senior management. One thing that's very important within our organization is we have to go from the top down, and our leaders set examples, and our leaders are the ones who help us drive change through the organization. In the third area, the consulting team were actually involved from the beginning. And Florian was able to join us himself at a meeting we had, I think probably in summer last year, when we started considering some of these aspects and developing a policy around it. And lastly, in the fourth part here, you can see a lot of the data that Florian brought and presented actually validated the findings we'd seen within our own fleet. So we knew we were on the right path and we knew we were on the right track. What we did find from all of this was there are obviously a lot of pros and cons. On the pro side, you've got a long list here, and I'm not going to go out and read through these one by one. You can read through them yourselves. But we found there's a lot of pros, and in the right environment, in the right place, these pros work very well. However, there's a lot of cons and there's a lot of potholes to watch out for as well. So when we looked at our own fleet, when we looked at the market data, we actually found a lot of lessons learned. And again, I'm not going to read through these. I think you can read through them yourself. But there are a lot of things that you need to look out for, and when building a strategy around hybrids, these are some of the potholes you need to avoid. So if we move on to the next one, this is pretty specific to Johnson & Johnson. There are some other considerations that needed to be thought of when we were developing this policy. You saw our Credo document, so the Credo expectations, the image of the companies is a very important factor for ourselves. Of course, our finance colleagues are looking at the budgetary impacts. Another aspect is, of course, the technical CO2 or the OEM CO2 versus the real environmental impacts, driver territory, and the mileage of the drivers that are taking on these vehicles, the maintenance costs and infrastructure, which you heard Florian talk a bit more about as well. We have a policy of 7 brands, so the amount of hybrids within those 7 brands now is quite extensive, so we have to include it in the policy. The tax considerations, which Florian spoke about, so I'm not going to talk about them in much detail. And lastly, the charging and the infrastructure, both at home and at the office for the drivers. The last point there, the correct usage of the hybrid technology is something we also looked at and covered, and very much in line with what Florian's saying about if someone's a Lewis Hamilton or a Fernando Alonso, or if someone is a more sensible and a correct driver. So the key conclusions from our analysis and our studies and all the information we gathered, which we basically presented to our senior managers, were first of all that the vehicles need to be used in a city landscape. I'm not sure, Stephen, if the first point's coming up here. Yep. So they need to be used, or they're most effective within a city landscape. Those hybrids that we did have where people were using them in towns or regional areas were not cost effective, but also in many cases actually created a larger CO2 footprint than the diesel equivalent vehicles. Very much what Florian said as well, driver behavior is key, both to the environmental impact, and here I mean the real environmental impact, and also the cost effectiveness of the vehicles. And lastly, there were some questions about employee compensation. So if someone was to install a charger at home, and obviously for our sales fleet, they're not coming into the office every day. So the panels, the charging stations need to be installed in their home, and also the cost of charging the vehicles. What we found is that can't be determined regionally, but must be looked at locally. So each country has its own regulations around compensation and benefit in this particular case, and it's not something you can set centrally. So we ended up developing this policy, and again, I'm not going to go through this in great detail. I believe you get a copy of this later on. But we did end up developing a policy. We presented this to our senior managers, obviously with all the data that we collected as well. And we developed this and got approval for this. So people who are living within and working within city landscapes, people who are 50 kilometers from the office, they need to be able to charge at home. Yearly mileage exceptions there. And they also, which is very important, need to take training how to manage the battery. And this we found very important because people take on hybrids and they don't really understand the batteries. And anyone who takes a mobile, the rules, you have to charge it up and let it run completely flat. So these kind of niches, we ask the drivers to be trained on before they take over the car. So to summarize and really to give some information to maybe people on the phone who are considering putting together a hybrid policy or alternative powertrain policy, what is very important for J&J, as I mentioned, is to get the input and the senior management buy-in. Sorry, Stephen, if you... So for J&J, it's part of our mindset, it's part of our philosophy. So getting the senior management buy-in is not such a big thing. But when you build a case study within your organization, you need to build it up on experience, market data, what the OEMs are telling you, and also it needs to be a clear message. It needs to be a clear guideline, a clear message of what you want to achieve by doing this. We've maintained our corporate image by applying alternative powertrains in an effective manner. So J&J doesn't have hybrid vehicles all over the world, driving in all different environments, but we're applying it to the right cityscapes, as mentioned earlier. And lastly, ensure you build your case study and policy built on your fleet circumstances. So you saw what our policy is. This isn't going to be applicable for everybody. Johnson & Johnson is not a bank. It's not a industrial company. It's a company that's a healthcare company, and our sales fleet very specifically are going to different institutions to what your sales fleet may be. So use the knowledge you've learned today to build up your own case study based on your own particular circumstances. And thank you, Stephen. Any questions, please submit them, and Florian and I will try and answer them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you for your insight. Sure, the participants have already learned a lot, but perhaps they have still some questions about integration of hybrid vehicles. So let's move on to the final part of this webinar, our Q&A session. So you can send your questions via the GoToWebinar tool, and we have already some questions. The first one is for Gregory Beck. Greg, it's a question from an international fleet manager, and he asks, when you talk about CO2 footprint, are you restricting, let's say, the CO2 footprint to drive power only, so fuel, electricity, hybrid vehicles, etc., or are you also looking at the production of the vehicle?
Very good question. To that level of detail, we didn't go, simply because this policy is across very many companies, and I'm sure the person asking the question has the same issue. It's across a lot of different countries. And of course, the production of electricity in each country is different. So it would have been a very complex case study to build. What we tried to do is keep it simple so that when we got to our senior managers, we were able to explain in a relatively simple way how we're moving forward. For us, it was also important, obviously, the other aspects, not just the CO2 footprint. but the other aspects that were mentioned as well. So that was simply part of the equation.
Okay. Another question for you, and afterwards we can also ask immediately for the opinion of Florian. The question is, how proactive is the leasing company you work with for you to follow your hybrid policy?
That again, very good question. Johnson Johnson's quite, well, not quite unique, but we are one of the companies that actually has self-funding, so we purchase our own vehicles. However, we work very closely with fleet management companies who are leasing companies ultimately in a number of markets to manage our fleet. And in those cases, they've been not only helpful in, as I mentioned, Florian here, who was part of our business case building process, but they also are working with us in each individual market to find the right vehicles and to help us deliver the right vehicles that we look for under the policy.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question for Florian. Florian, the question is not immediately related to hybrid vehicles, but goes a little bit further. The question is, are CNG and LPG models still in consideration to the internal combustion engines? What are the biggest constraints, let's say, for further massive introduction on fleets? Florian? Okay, we lost Florian, I think. Hello, Florian? There seems to be a problem. Greg, can you hear me?
I can, Steven, yes.
Okay, then we go further with a question for you. There is a question, even though GE brought the advice perhaps not to go for plugged-in hybrid vehicles, J&J did so because of image and environmental reasons. One of the criteria stated was that those full hybrid EVs have lower maintenance. How does this work for you? What is your experience in terms of maintenance cost, and how do you see that? How do you follow that up?
Yep, thanks. And maybe just a correction. I mean, what Florian has presented is a broad overview of the market. So it doesn't specifically look at if someone's only driving in a city or if someone's only driving in the country. So the information we got from GE is very much what we built our policy as part of, and that is that within a city it does make sense. Within certain environments it does make sense. And then in terms of the maintenance, what we have found is the OEMs have really stepped up in a big way in terms of making sure there's a substantial maintenance network. Of course, the classic internal combustion engine you can take to any service network and get it fixed or maintained. And what we found is the OEMs are capable at almost all of their stations of working on the hybrid vehicles as well as they can work on an internal combustion engine. Also, what we found is we still have to take the car, of course, for yearly maintenance. Nothing changes there. But what we're starting to see now is there's far less requirement for parts and, of course, the labor that goes along with that. So we're starting to see that trend now. We're not fully through getting all the hybrids in that we could probably have, but we're starting to see that as a trend now, and I think it's going to be, let's see what happens, but it's starting to look as if the maintenance costs are factually reduced.
Okay, another question for you, and then we will try again with Florian. The question is, can you provide an example of how you calculate the reimbursement rates for electricity used when recharging at home?
Well, as mentioned in the presentation, that's different per country, and that's based on either legislation or based on our own internal policies. So that's actually not something that we got into, but we did work with our HR colleagues as part of a Kompen-Ben part of the program. And our HR colleagues went away and worked on that. So unfortunately, I don't have too much information on that. However, I know our HR colleagues did it on a country-by-country basis. And so it's one policy for all employees in each individual country. But the actual calculations and the actual formulas behind it, I wasn't involved in, and I can't give too much information on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. Then let's try again with Florian. Florian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hopefully you can hear me now as well.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so the question asked for you was regarding CNG, LPG models. How do you see that? What are for you the biggest constraints when you look at, let's say, all types of alternative powertrains?
Yeah, CNG and LPG had a huge trend a couple of years ago as the technology was introduced, and in most of the countries you had tax benefits on purchasing CNG and LPG itself on the fuel stations. Overall, the big problem still is the lack of fuel station infrastructure. There are a few markets like Italy which are pretty mature in it, but in the majority of countries you really struggle to just go from one end of the city to the other side. And of course also here the big problem is again the driver behavior. There is not even one product available who is driving its car just with CNG or LPG. There is always the ICE engine in the background as well the fuel tank. Unless you have that possibility, drivers still refueling more that piece versus the alternative version. So that's again something where you would need to make sure the driver is changing its behavior and doesn't come back always with like, oh, sorry, there wasn't a fuel station existing, so I had to take petrol or diesel.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question for you, Florian. Looking at the TCO of a company car, in what way does the TCO composition of a hybrid vehicle differ from a combustion engine vehicle? You already mentioned some elements, and what can you do, let's say, to make sure that the TCO is the most optimal?
Yeah, if we review the theoretical TCO, we definitely see a bigger proportion on the depreciation side, while the fuel and tax component is less compared to combustion engine. But as I presented before, and as soon as we're reviewing the existing cars on the road, and we see that the fuel is much more impacting the overall result as initially thought. So it really depends on if you look at the theory or the reality. I suggest to include also a driver education program. It might not be very expensive, but it will help to drive the behavior change itself. And it will strongly contribute to achieving the benefits in reality. So you need to consider a bit more than just the typical theoretical TCO comparison as we are all used to out of the past.
Okay, a question for Greg. Greg, you introduced alternative powertrain vehicles. You have 3,000 alternative powertrain vehicles in your fleet today, but there is a question about the necessity of change management that probably you have to go through because it asks, let's say, also for some kind of adaptation of driver behavior, of the acceptance, etc. So what tips do you have for fleet managers who have to drive the change in their company and with their drivers when they want to, let's say, implement alternative powertrain vehicles?
Yeah, and this is a tough one, and I think everyone probably has to look at their own company and their own set of drivers. However, what we did was a lot of the responsibility and the ownership is actually shifted to the driver in a way that we realized that someone may live in a certain house or flat or whatever today, and tomorrow they may move. And part of that administration was going to fall on HR. So what we did was we changed the way we did things, and we actually have the driver sign a document before they apply to get the car or to get the hybrid vehicle, which says, you know, as of conditions today, I am in these conditions, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to have the training. I'm going to look after the battery, etc. So there's a kind of a, it's not a contract. It's not even stored with HR. It's actually stored with the fleet management company, but they have to physically sign it to say that they're going to, first of all, they meet the criteria to take a hybrid, but also they're going to be looking after the vehicle. So that shifts some of the responsibility to them. The second part is what I mentioned earlier, that our business case came from senior management. So we're lucky enough to have on our fleet steering committee a lady who's the company group chair of the pharma team. So she's responsible for the whole pharma business within Europe, Middle East, Africa. And she was our partner in putting together, or she's our senior manager who we bounce our ideas off, and she was the one who gave the approval for this policy. And so when someone like that sends through the organization a message saying, you know, this is the way we do things now, this is the new hybrid policy, then it also makes our job a lot easier when we go into the local markets and say, okay, we're looking at your car policy for next year, we need to make sure hybrids are in there. Here's the message from Jane, and this is how we're going to do it. So it all plays a role in how to get the change management done and how to get the local change management and the local management team on board.
Okay. Another question for you. If you had to do things over again, what would you do differently and why? And how would you do it?
I mean, looking at it retrospectively, I think we did all that we could. We spoke to as many people as we could. We made sure we had a strong business case, and we drove the change. So from that aspect, I think we've done the right thing, and I think we've driven the changes forward that we needed to drive forward, and we've made the right decision. In terms of changing one thing or another, you know, I think probably the best thing that we could have done, or the thing that we could have done a bit different, was actually speak to the local teams a lot earlier in the process, and we could have got more information of where they were at that particular time. So that was the probably one thing that I would look at more critically than what the other things that we did.
Okay, thank you very much. We will end this Q&A with two little questions for Florian. Florian, I want to know that, or looking at your figures that you presented and also the study, is it not too early to think about the integration of alternative powertrain vehicles in a car fleet?
Steve, not at all. I think if you would like to integrate an alternative powertrains, it will be more important to start soon. So first of all, if you need to prepare a clear strategy and will be eligible knows why and where, then the next step would be together with HR to build a car policy around and to identify the needs which needs to be amended. So it takes some time, and I think Greg also said when we started to look at it together last year, and I'm sure that Johnson & Johnson started looking into it earlier than just at the moment as myself and the team jumped into to support that exercise. So I think as soon as you start, as sooner you will be prepared for the future. And the future is now. The only thing is, do not forget about the circumstances such as the charging points, the reimbursing of the misbehavioral usage, and many more things such as what happens if an employee is moving from one house to the other, and you need to restructure the charging station point as well, just as an example.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian. And really, the final question was just sent. Greg, I hope you are still there. The question is quite simple, but really important. Did you make any savings through this hybrid policy?
I think it's too early to make that assessment right now. As mentioned, Florian came in around summertime last year, I guess, when we were starting to finalize our business case. So the policy only went live in October, November time, I guess. So right now, I don't know. Obviously, the initial upfront cost of a hybrid is more expensive, and you get that back on the fuel costs. So it's going to come in time, I guess. But the financing and the savings aspect of it is only part of the equation for us. I mean, there's all those other things I mentioned as other considerations and things that we look at. So hopefully we will get some savings, but it's not the primary criteria for why we did this.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Florian. We have come to the end of this Fleet Europe webinar with the support of G Capital International. I want to thank everyone, also the audience. As you can see, we have recorded, let's say, this session, and the recording will be available afterwards on the Fleet Europe website, so that if you are interested in seeing once again some of the details and the key figures of the presentations, then you can see that in the recorded version. And of course, please spare a few minutes of your time, because we have a little satisfaction survey in order to help us improve and optimize future Fleet Europe webinars. And last but not least, let's have a great day, and I hope to welcome you soon for a future Fleet Europe webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.